In Part 4, we move into integrated risk management, where everything comes together. This is where organizations move beyond managing risk in silos and start applying one consistent risk model across security, privacy, and AI. Rather than having separate approaches, separate registers, and separate decisions, we begin to see risk as a single, connected view, with different impacts depending on the domain. This shift is critical, because as organizations adopt AI and handle increasing volumes of personal data, risk can no longer be managed in isolation. It needs to be understood, assessed, and treated in a way that reflects how these domains intersect in practice. And that's what integrated risk management enables: one model, one view, and better decision-making across the organization. Before we talk about integration, it's important to understand the problem. In many organizations, risk is still managed separately across different standards. This often results in multiple risk registers, different scoring models, and inconsistent risk criteria and appetite. Controls are duplicated across frameworks, and in some cases, treatment decisions can even conflict with one another. The real-world impact is significant. You end up with inconsistent risk decisions, increased audit complexity, and poor traceability across the system. And perhaps most importantly, leadership loses visibility. They can't see the organization's true risk exposure in a single, consolidated view. The key insight is simple. Multiple risk models don't just create complexity, they lead to fragmented governance. This is where integrated risk management really starts to show its value. At a practical level, it leads to better decisions, because risk is no longer assessed in isolation. Instead, it's understood across security, privacy, and AI, giving a more complete and accurate picture. It also reduces duplication. Rather than managing separate risk registers, separate controls, and separate treatment plans, organizations operate with a single, consistent approach. From a leadership perspective, this creates clear executive visibility. Decision-makers can see the organization's true risk exposure in one place, rather than across fragmented views. And importantly, it strengthens audit outcomes. Auditors are looking for consistency, traceability, and alignment, and integration makes that visible across the entire system. To bring this to life, consider a simple example. An AI chatbot exposing personal data is a single event, but it has multiple impacts. There's a security impact in terms of data exposure, a privacy impact in terms of personal information and regulatory risk, and an AI impact relating to model behavior and trust. But instead of treating these separately, we apply one treatment approach, selecting and implementing controls that address the risk holistically. And that's the key idea. One event, multiple impacts, and one integrated response. So what does integrated risk management actually mean in practice? At its core, it's about consistency. It starts with one risk methodology, using the same definitions, the same scoring model, and the same criteria across the organization. This is supported by one shared risk language, so that teams across IT, legal, AI, and the wider business are all aligned in how risk is understood and communicated. And importantly, it leads to one decision-making model, where risk acceptance and prioritization are applied consistently rather than differently across domains. The key point is this: integration is not just about bringing things together. It's about creating a consistent way of understanding and managing risk across the organization. This slide introduces the risk management lifecycle across the integrated management system. We begin with organizational context in Clause 4, where the organization defines its internal and external environment, as well as the needs and expectations of interested parties. This sets the foundation for how risk is understood. From there, we move into risk assessment, primarily in Clause 6, where risks are identified and analyzed, looking at cause, event, and impact, and assessing likelihood and impact across security, privacy, and AI. Once risks are understood, we move into risk treatment, where appropriate controls are selected and actions are defined to address those risks. While the planning sits in Clause 6, implementation takes place in Clause 8. Risk evaluation and acceptance also sit within this space, ensuring that risks are assessed against defined criteria and either accepted or treated based on the organization's risk appetite. At the center of this life cycle, we have continuous communication and consultation, alongside monitoring and review in Clause 9. This ensures that risk remains visible, controlled, and aligned with the organization's objectives. And importantly, this life cycle feeds into continual improvement in Clause 10, where lessons learned, audit results, and performance insights drive ongoing enhancement of the system. The key point is this: risk is not a one-time activity. It is a continuous, integrated life cycle across the management system. This slide shows how the integrated approach maps directly to the ISO management system lifecycle. We start with Clause 4, where organizational context is defined, but in an integrated model, this is not just security. It includes security, privacy, and AI from the outset. Moving into Clauses 6 and 8, we apply a unified approach to risk. Risks are identified using a consistent structure: cause, event, and impact, and then analyzed across multiple domains, ensuring that security, privacy, and AI impacts are all considered together. From there, we develop a single, integrated treatment plan. Controls are selected once and applied across the different standards, creating a shared control environment rather than duplicating effort. In Clause 9, monitoring and review are unified, giving one consolidated view of risk performance, control effectiveness, and ongoing exposure. And finally, in Clause 10, everything feeds into continuous improvement, ensuring that the system evolves based on real data, real outcomes, and changing risks. This is where integrated risk assessment becomes very practical. We start with identification, using a structured approach of cause, event, and impact. This helps us clearly understand why something could happen, what could happen, and what the consequences would be. At the cause level, we look at threats and vulnerabilities, whether that's phishing, weak access controls, or even issues like poor training data in AI models. We then define the event, what actually happens. This could be a data breach, unauthorized access, or an AI model behaving in an unintended or biased way. Once the risk is defined, we move into analysis, assessing likelihood and impact. But in an integrated model, impact is not assessed in isolation. We look at it across multiple domains. Security, in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Privacy, in terms of personal data exposure and regulatory impact. And AI, in terms of bias, fairness, harm, and reputational risk. And this leads to the key insight. A single event can have multiple impact types. That's why risk needs to be assessed once, but understood across all domains. This is where risk assessment transitions into decision-making through evaluation and treatment. We start with risk evaluation, where the assessed risk rating is compared against defined risk criteria. This includes considering the organization's risk appetite and tolerance, as well as legal and regulatory requirements, particularly for privacy and AI. At this stage, we also look at business impact and priorities, ensuring that risk decisions are aligned with what matters most to the organization. Based on this, a clear decision is made. Is the risk acceptable? Does it require treatment? Or does it need escalation? If the risk is accepted, this becomes a formal decision to accept residual risk. This is not informal. It must be based on control effectiveness, the level of residual risk, and a clear business justification. And importantly, risk acceptance must be owned and documented, with a defined risk owner, formal approval, and clear justification. Throughout this process, evaluation is not limited to a single perspective. We assess impact across multiple domains. Security, in terms of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Privacy, in terms of personal data exposure and regulatory risk. And AI, in terms of bias, fairness, and ethical impact. The key point is this: risk evaluation and acceptance must be consistent, justified, and integrated across all domains, not treated separately. This is where risk is translated into action, through integrated risk treatment. We start with the treatment decision. For each risk, The organization decides whether to accept, avoid, transfer, or treat the risk. Where the decision is to treat, this is where control selection comes in, and this is also where the statement of applicability becomes central. Controls are selected once, and then mapped across the relevant standards: ISO 27001 for security, ISO 27700 for privacy, and ISO 42000 for AI. This ensures consistency and avoids duplication across the management system. These selected controls form your statement of applicability. The SOA lists the controls, justifies why they are included or excluded, and links each control directly back to the risks they address. From there, we move into the treatment plan. This is where actions are defined, owners are assigned, and timelines are established to ensure that treatment is implemented effectively. Finally, in Clause 8, those controls are implemented in practice. This is where policies, processes, and technical measures are put in place, and where evidence is generated to demonstrate that controls are operating effectively. The key point is this: risk treatment is not just about selecting controls, it's about creating a traceable path from risk, to control, to implementation, and ultimately to evidence. In an integrated management system, risk treatment is not performed separately for each standard. A single risk is addressed through coordinated actions across security, privacy, and AI. Controls are selected once and mapped across ISO 27001, ISO 27701, and ISO 42001, ensuring consistency, reducing duplication, and strengthening overall risk management. This example shows what an integrated risk register looks like in practice. At the top, we define the risk clearly using a structured statement linking cause, event, and impact. This ensures that the risk is understood consistently across the organization. We then break this down into threats, vulnerabilities, assets, and domains, in this case covering security, privacy, and AI. This is where integration starts to become visible. Importantly, the risk is directly linked back to organizational context, including internal and external issues, as well as interested parties and their requirements. This ensures alignment with Clause 4 from the outset. From there, the risk is assessed across multiple domains. You can see how security, privacy, and AI impacts are all considered together, resulting in a single, consolidated risk rating. Based on this, a clear evaluation decision is made, and a treatment strategy is defined. Treatment actions are then specified, and importantly, these are not isolated. They are mapped across domains, with defined owners, timelines, and status, ensuring accountability and execution. We then see how this links directly into control selection. Controls are mapped across ISO 27000, ISO 27701, and ISO 42000, and reflected in the statement of applicability. From there, the register extends into operation, showing how controls are implemented, what processes support them, and what evidence is generated. Finally, it connects into monitoring and improvement, including metrics, audit linkage, corrective actions, and lessons learned. The key point is this: this is not just a risk register, it is a fully traceable chain from context, to risk, to control, to evidence, and continuous improvement. This is what integrated risk reporting looks like in practice: a single, consolidated view of risk across the organization. At the top, we have the executive summary. This provides a quick snapshot of total risk exposure, including the number of risks, how many are high or critical, and an immediate sense of overall risk posture. We then move into risk metrics. This shows how risk is distributed across domain security, privacy, and AI, as well as highlighting the organization's top risks. This is where leadership can quickly understand where attention is needed. Finally, we look at treatment progress. This shows how risks are being managed in practice, what has been implemented, what is in progress, and what is still planned or overdue. The key point is this: this is not just reporting, it's decision support. It gives leadership one clear, consistent view of risk, enabling better prioritization, stronger oversight, and more informed decision-making across the organization. Governance integration is where everything comes together. At the ownership level, risk is not centralized, it sits with the business. Business owners, system owners, data owners, and AI owners are all accountable for the risks within their domains. But ownership alone is not enough, it needs to be supported by structured oversight. This is where governance functions come in through risk committees, security governance, privacy oversight, and AI governance. What integration does is align these layers. Instead of operating in silos, they are connected through a shared risk view, a common methodology, and consistent reporting. In practice, this means one risk register, one set of metrics, and one view of risk presented to leadership. And this is where organizations start to see real value because leadership can finally see risk clearly across all domains. From an audit perspective, this is where integration becomes very visible. Auditors are not just looking for risk assessments, they are looking for consistency, traceability, and integration. They want to see that the organization is using one unified risk methodology, not separate approaches for security, privacy, and AI. They will follow the trail from a risk to the selected control and into the statement of applicability to confirm that decisions are justified and implemented. There is also a strong focus on whether privacy and AI risks are embedded into the same framework, rather than treated as isolated exercises. Consistency in scoring is key. If different teams assess risk differently, the overall risk posture becomes unreliable. And most importantly, auditors will look for evidence that risks are actively reviewed and updated, not just documented once and forgotten. This is often where organizations fall short, and where the most value can be demonstrated. This is where most organizations struggle when trying to integrate security, privacy, and AI. The first challenge is organizational. Different teams operate in silos, each with their own priorities and ways of working. Legal focuses on compliance, IT focuses on operations, and AI teams focus on innovation, which often leads to conflicting decisions. On top of that, terminology becomes a major issue. The same word, like risk or impact, can mean very different things across domains. Then we see tooling challenges, multiple risk registers, disconnected systems, and a lack of central visibility. The solution is not just technical, it's structural. Organizations need to standardize how risk is defined and assessed, implement a single methodology, and ensure that all stakeholders are aligned through training and governance. That's what enables true integration. So we close this part of the series. The key takeaway is this. If your risk model is not integrated, your management system is not integrated. Everything we've covered comes back to consistency, traceability, and a single, unified way of understanding risk across security, privacy, and AI. And this is where integration moves from concept to capability. In the next part, we take this one step further. We'll look at how risks are translated into controls and how this is reflected in the statement of applicability, forming the foundation of your control environment and your audit readiness. Because ultimately, it's not just about identifying risk, it's about how you control it and how you prove it.